The hallway smelled of fresh paint and echoing voices, a mix of first-day excitement and quiet dread. Elijah Brooks moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone used to not being seen, and even more used to not being heard. His shoulders weren't slouched, but they weren't rigid either. He carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to take up just enough space to get by, but not enough to draw attention. He had a notebook under one arm and an old graphing calculator tucked in his back pocket. It still worked, even though it had cracks along the edges like tiny lightning bolts frozen in plastic. Westbridge University was a place that looked like it had been built to intimidate. Everything was made of marble or glass, cold and clean. It felt like a monument to something he was still trying to understand. But Elijah didn't come from marble. He came from creaky wooden floors, dusty library books, and a father who worked long nights cleaning buildings like this one. His neighborhood was more about survival than success. But even in the roughest places, there are pockets of light, places where dreams are whispered like secrets, and hope is folded into every page of a second-hand textbook. His father used to say, "Son, the world might not give you anything for free, but it can't stop you from learning." And Elijah had taken that to heart. He had taught himself calculus from YouTube videos and library books while other kids were playing ball. It wasn't that he didn't want to play, he just knew his window to change things was smaller. And so, when the acceptance letter from Westbridge had come in the mail, creased and crumpled from too many hands, it had felt like more than just a letter. It was a key. Maybe even a ticket. Room 306 was the lecture hall for advanced calculus. The seats curved in a wide arc, sloping toward a giant whiteboard at the bottom. Elijah took a spot in the third row, not too eager, not too distant. He watched as students filled in around him, some with expensive laptops, others whispering about last night's party. Most of them didn't notice him. A few gave him that look, the one where curiosity mixes with assumption. But Elijah didn't flinch. He knew how to read a room. He knew how to wait. The door opened sharply, and Professor Leonard Grayson walked in. Everything about him was polished. His shoes clicked with purpose. His tie was knotted too tightly, like he was trying to control the very air around him. He carried a leather satchel that looked older than most of the students in the room. His hair was white, not from age alone but from time spent commanding spaces like this one. He had that look, one part brilliance, one part arrogance. He didn't say good morning. He didn't smile. He simply walked to the board and began writing a problem. It was long and complicated, one of those math problems that felt more like a dare than a lesson. The kind that turned confidence into silence. Symbols stacked upon symbols. Integrals nested inside limits, variables twisting like a labyrinth. When he finished, he turned around slowly and said, "This, ladies and gentlemen, is calculus at its most unkind. Few will solve it by the end of the term. Most will not even try. But let's see where we stand today." He scanned the room like a hawk. Then, his eyes stopped. Right on Elijah. "You," he said, pointing. "Name?" "Elijah Brooks," he replied, steady. "Well, Mr. Brooks," the professor said, as if tasting the name, "why don't you come solve this for us? Let's see what the public school system has produced this year." The room went still. A few students looked around uncomfortably. One or two snickered under their breath. Elijah didn't show it, but he felt the heat behind his ears. Still, he stood. He walked down the steps with the same quiet grace, picked up a piece of chalk, and stared at the board. He wasn't angry. He was ready. The numbers sang to him. He could see the answer before he reached the second line. It was like the problem unraveled itself in front of him, inviting him in. He worked through it calmly, erasing here, substituting there, folding it all down into something clean, something true. In just under 3 minutes, he had boxed the final answer, 3E. He set the chalk down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and returned to his seat without looking at the professor. Grayson stared at the board, eyes narrowing. He adjusted his glasses. Then cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered. "Lucky guess." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. For the rest of the lecture, the professor didn't call on him again. But his eyes lingered more often. Watching. Waiting for a mistake that wouldn't come. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Professor Grayson would challenge Elijah with increasingly complex problems, many of which were taken from graduate-level textbooks. Elijah solved them all, not with arrogance, but with clarity. Each time, he approached the board with the same steady breath and quiet hands. It wasn't just intelligence, it was grace under pressure. Mastery born from necessity. Outside of class, Elijah kept to himself. He studied at the library, usually staying past closing. He'd found a custodian there named Mr. Davis who would let him stay an extra hour while he cleaned. Mr. Davis had a son Elijah's age and said he reminded him of him, always reaching, always hungry to learn. Sometimes Elijah would help him sweep the floors just to say thank you. They didn't talk much, but when they did, it was about real things. "You ever get tired?" Mr. Davis asked once, while mopping the far hallway. "All the time," Elijah replied. "Then why don't you quit?" Elijah looked at him. "Because I want to know what it feels like to make my dad proud. To lift him up the way he's been lifting me." Mr. Davis smiled. "That's real." But not everyone shared that admiration. In class, some students started to whisper. One girl, who wore designer everything, said once, loud enough to hear, "I mean, he's good at math, but let's be honest, it's probably some kind of prodigy story. Like a fluke. Bet he can't write a decent essay." Elijah heard it. He didn't react. But it stuck. It wasn't just about proving he could solve equations. It was about proving he belonged. Back in the lecture hall, Professor Grayson's attitude hadn't changed. If anything, it had sharpened. He rarely praised Elijah. Instead, he gave compliments wrapped in condescension. "Interesting solution, Mr. Brooks. Though unconventional. Or worse, not bad. For someone of your background." One afternoon, after class, Elijah stayed behind. He waited until the room had cleared out. Then he approached the desk where Grayson was packing up. "Sir," Elijah began, voice calm. "Can I ask you something?" Grayson looked up, mildly surprised. "Of course. Do you think I don't notice?" Elijah asked. "The way you only call on me when you want to prove something? The way you never really see me as a student, just a spectacle?" Grayson frowned. "You're imagining things." "No, I'm not," Elijah said, gently. "And I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking to be treated like I belong here." There was a long pause. Grayson said nothing. Then returned to his papers. Elijah turned and left. The following week, flyers appeared around campus. A mathematics competition was coming up. Open to all students, undergrad and graduate. The prize was a research grant and a chance to intern at a prestigious institute. In class, Grayson made an announcement. "I suggest those with real aptitude consider participating," he said, scanning the room. Then, locking eyes with Elijah, he added, "Assuming you're up for the challenge." Elijah didn't respond. But that night, he signed up. When he called his dad, there was a long silence on the other end after he explained the competition. "You really think you can win?" his father asked. "I don't think," Elijah said. "I know." He didn't say it out of arrogance. He said it because he had to believe it. Belief, for Elijah, was the first ingredient to change. And he wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for every kid who had been underestimated, overlooked, or pushed aside. He was doing it for the tired hands that cleaned schools at night. For the broken calculators and the second-hand textbooks. For the dream that somehow still burned, even in a world that tried to snuff it out. The night before the competition, he sat alone in the library. Mr. Davis passed by with his mop and looked at him. "Tomorrow's the day?" "Yeah," Elijah said, closing his book. "It's time." Mr. Davis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Make them remember your name." And that was all Elijah needed. The morning of the competition arrived crisp and cloudless. A breeze moved softly through the trees on campus, as if even nature was holding its breath. Elijah woke before his alarm, already dressed in his mind before his body moved. He didn't have a lucky charm or a ritual. What he had was discipline. He brushed his teeth, folded his blanket neatly on the edge of his bed, and packed a bottle of water, 2 pens, and a small notebook into his backpack. His dad had called him that morning, voice thick with emotion. "Do your best, son. No matter what happens today, I'm already proud of you." Those words echoed in Elijah's mind as he stepped into the university's grand auditorium. The place had been transformed. Rows of tables had been set up, each one numbered, spaced far apart like islands. Judges in navy blazers moved quietly between them, clipboards in hand. A digital timer hung from the ceiling like a spotlight counting down a show everyone had come to see. The competition was open to all levels, so some faces were familiar, others older, wearing glasses and lab coats. Elijah took his seat at table 17. He glanced at the others. No one met his eyes. Except one. Professor Grayson stood near the back of the room with 2 other faculty members. His hands were clasped behind his back, face unreadable. When their eyes met, Elijah gave a respectful nod. Grayson didn't return it. A few moments later, the head judge stepped forward to the microphone and gave a short welcome. The rules were simple, 3 rounds, increasing in difficulty. Each round would eliminate a portion of the contestants. Finalists would complete a problem designed by a panel of university mathematicians. Calculators were forbidden. Time limits enforced. The winner would be chosen not just for the correct answer, but for the elegance and logic of their solution. Round 1 began with a buzzer. A white envelope was handed to each participant. Elijah opened his carefully, eyes scanning the dense rows of equations. Limits, derivatives, proofs. He leaned forward, closed his eyes for a brief second, then started writing. His pencil danced across the page, not rushed, not slow, deliberate. Each answer checked and rechecked. He finished with 7 minutes left. He sat back and waited. When time was called, judges collected the papers. A 30-minute break followed. Elijah stood, stretching. Some students paced nervously. A few whispered to each other. One nearby, wearing a Columbia hoodie, glanced at Elijah with mild surprise. "You don't seem nervous." Elijah gave a small smile. "I've done harder problems under a streetlight." The student blinked. Respect. The results for round 1 were posted on digital screens outside the hall. Elijah's name appeared at the top, Elijah Brooks, perfect score. A few gasps echoed. A couple of heads turned. He noticed a group of graduate students murmuring. Someone pointed. But Elijah didn't linger. He returned to his seat quietly, preparing his mind for the next round. Round 2 was even more brutal. The questions sprawled across multiple pages, incorporating real-world applications, optimizing structures, rates of change in economics, wave functions. But Elijah didn't falter. He wrote as if the numbers spoke in his ear. When the buzzer ended the round, he set his pencil down gently and looked ahead. Another 30 minutes passed. Again, the screen lit up. Again, his name stood at the top. People weren't just whispering now. They were watching. closely. Students began to realize that this wasn't some fluke or underdog fairy tale. This was a storm in real time, and Elijah was its calm center. Then came the final round. The last problem was placed on the table by the head judge himself. 1 page. 1 question. 1 chance. It was a theoretical calculus challenge, abstract, elegant, and dizzyingly complex. The kind of question meant to separate the truly exceptional from the merely brilliant. Elijah read it once. Then again. He saw the path, not immediately, but forming, like stars aligning into a constellation. He didn't rush. He broke it down piece by piece. What others saw as chaos, he saw as choreography. As the timer wound down, he boxed his answer, underlined it once, and set his pencil down. The buzzer rang. It was done. They called a break before announcing the results. Elijah stepped outside, the cool air filling his lungs. A few students approached him, some congratulating, some curious, some still skeptical. One of the graduate students from MIT said, "That last question, man, how do you even know where to start?" Elijah shrugged. You don't always need to see the whole road. Just enough of the next step. Inside, the judges were conferring. There was a heated debate. One judge, a tenured professor from Princeton, had been particularly impressed with Elijah's reasoning. He pointed out that not only was the answer correct, but Elijah's method was more elegant than anything they'd seen. The others agreed. The final announcement came an hour later. The auditorium filled with applause as the head judge took the stage. This year, we've witnessed extraordinary talent from across institutions. But one student has demonstrated not only accuracy, but a mastery of logic, creativity, and clarity that set him apart from even the most seasoned contenders. The winner of this year's Westbridge Mathematics Invitational is Elijah Brooks. The applause was thunderous, but not unanimous. Some clapped out of politeness. Some from awe. But many rose to their feet out of something deeper, respect. Not for the idea of Elijah, but for the undeniable truth of him. Elijah stood, not beaming but calm. Like someone who had always known this moment would come, even if the world hadn't. He walked up to the stage. Shook hands. Accepted the award. The research grant. The internship. And then, just as he was stepping off the stage, he saw him, Professor Grayson. Standing still. Not clapping. Not frowning. Just watching. Their eyes locked again, and for a moment, Elijah thought he saw something shift. Not surrender. Not apology. But perhaps, recognition. Later that week, a quiet email arrived in Elijah's inbox. Mr. Brooks, I would like to invite you to speak to my graduate class next Friday on the topic of intuitive problem solving in complex calculus. Your insights during the competition suggest a unique perspective. I believe the students, and myself, could benefit from it. Let me know if you're interested. Professor Leonard Grayson. Elijah read it twice. He closed his laptop and exhaled. The offer wasn't an apology. But it was a crack in the wall. And sometimes, that's all you need to let the light in. That Friday, he stood before Grayson's graduate students. At first, they looked at him the way the undergrads had, unsure, skeptical. But within minutes, that changed. He explained not just the how of calculus, but the why. He used metaphors, stories, bridges to understanding. The kind of teaching that reaches not just the mind but the heart. When the class ended, Grayson approached him. He didn't smile. But he offered his hand. I was wrong, he said, quietly. About a lot of things. Elijah took the hand. I figured you'd figure it out eventually. You're good at math. Grayson chuckled, a dry sound, but real. Weeks passed. Elijah's name began to circulate among faculty, research boards, and even academic journals. He was offered a summer project with a team at Caltech. Recommendations poured in. But Elijah remained grounded. He still tutored kids from his neighborhood on Zoom. Still walked the same path to the library. Still helped Mr. Davis clean up some nights just to say thank you. His father came to visit that spring. They walked the campus together, slow and proud. When they reached the steps of the auditorium, his dad looked up and said, "You changed something here. Maybe more than you know." And he had. Because it was never just about math. It was about making room at the table. About reshaping how brilliance is seen and understood. About reminding the world that genius isn't wrapped in privilege or pedigree, it can come from anywhere. Even from the back row. Even from the boy with the cracked calculator and the fire in his eyes. That year, Westbridge quietly revised its professor training on classroom bias. They launched a scholarship in Elijah's name for underrepresented students in mathematics. And the first person invited to sit on the selection board? Elijah Brooks. Elijah sat on the edge of his dorm bed, staring out the window at the quiet quad bathed in morning sun. A letter from Caltech rested open on his desk, a formal invitation to join a summer fellowship for mathematical innovation and machine learning. A full scholarship. A living stipend. A direct path to graduate research. Most would have jumped at it without a second thought. But Elijah sat still, his fingers woven tightly in front of him. There was joy, yes. Pride. But there was also something else tugging at him, something deeper than ambition. His phone buzzed with a text from Jalen, his childhood best friend. Just 4 words, "They need you here." Attached was a video. Elijah tapped it. It showed a group of high school students in their old neighborhood, seated on plastic chairs in a parking lot. A young volunteer was trying to teach calculus using a whiteboard propped against a fence. Cars passed in the background. Kids leaned in, hungry to understand. He turned the screen off and leaned back. That evening, Elijah called the Caltech board. He thanked them, graciously, sincerely, and asked if his offer could be deferred by a year. They were surprised, but agreed. No one had ever postponed such an opportunity, for such a reason. Over the next 3 months, Elijah returned home to create something no one had expected, a free, traveling STEM boot camp for underserved Black and brown youth across the state. He called it, Numbers Without Borders. The mission was simple, to teach young minds that math wasn't a gatekeeper, but a tool of freedom. He rented a van. Bought folding chairs, used laptops, and whiteboards with his award money. He reached out to local churches, community centers, and even barber shops. Wherever there was space and need, he showed up. Sometimes with a projector, sometimes just with chalk and pavement. Word spread quickly. What started with a dozen students in a church basement became 50 in a school gym. Then hundreds. Soon, local news caught on. Ivy League student brings genius home, the headline read. But Elijah never let it get to his head. One afternoon, as he wrapped up a lesson on complex functions in a makeshift classroom inside a laundromat, a little girl tugged his shirt. She couldn't have been more than 10. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "is it true you beat all the white kids at their own game?" Elijah knelt to her level, a gentle smile on his face. "I didn't beat anybody. I just remembered who I was, and showed them too." He gave her a notebook, one he used during his own training, filled with ideas and problems. "Write your own story in here." While building his program, Elijah kept in touch with Westbridge. Professor Grayson, once a symbol of gatekeeping, now became one of the initiative's silent allies. He never asked for credit, but when Elijah needed old exam sheets, advanced problem sets, or connections to grants, Grayson provided them, quietly and efficiently. One evening, Elijah received an invitation from the White House. The President's Council on Education had learned about his work. They wanted him to speak, briefly, about educational equity and youth empowerment. Elijah hesitated at first. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even trying to be an activist. But eventually, he said yes, not for himself, but for every student whose brilliance had been doubted. Standing at the podium in Washington, dressed in a second-hand suit tailored with care, Elijah began his speech not with statistics or jargon, but with a story. He told them about the cracked calculator his father found at a pawn shop. About the nights under flickering street lamps. About the professor who tried to humiliate him. And the day he proved not just his genius, but his worth. He ended with these words. Genius doesn't always look like what we've been taught. Sometimes it speaks with a different rhythm. Dresses in thrift clothes. Comes from single mothers and silent fathers. Sometimes it walks into your classroom from the back row, unsure if it belongs. And all it needs is one chance. One open door. I got mine. My job now is to hold it open. The audience stood in applause. That clip would go viral within hours. Major universities began reviewing their admissions rubrics. Donors offered to fund numbers without borders. Even corporations called, offering Elijah positions in high-level research teams. But Elijah knew, not yet. Back at Westbridge, the culture had started to shift. A few professors, inspired by Elijah's story, launched new mentorship programs for marginalized students. Office hours became more inclusive. Peer-to-peer tutoring networks were established. It was subtle, slow, and imperfect. But it was real. One evening, Elijah returned to Westbridge to guest lecture in Professor Grayson's class. As he walked into the same room where he'd once been humiliated, a round of soft applause greeted him. Students smiled. Some nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Not because he was famous, but because he had become something rarer, respected. Grayson introduced him without a script. His voice firm, clear. This is Elijah Brooks. A mathematician. A mentor. A man I've learned from. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't remind anyone of what had happened that day, long ago. He just taught. With kindness. With patience. With brilliance. That night, as he walked across campus, he ran into Mia, one of the only other black students in the calculus course from the beginning. She grinned. You know, the day you walked into Grayson's class, I remember thinking, he's gonna either break or change everything. Guess which one it was? Elijah chuckled. Little bit of both, I hope. She looked at him, serious now. You gave people like me permission to believe again. That matters more than any trophy. Elijah nodded slowly. Then it was all worth it. In the months that followed, Elijah's boot camp expanded into a permanent nonprofit. Numbers Without Borders opened its first learning hub in Baltimore, then Chicago, then Atlanta. Not fancy buildings, but safe, brilliant spaces where young people could explore math, science, and technology with teachers who looked like them, believed in them. Elijah still taught, still traveled, still kept his hand in solving high-level problems. But he never let the math become just about the numbers. For him, it was always about the people. One fall morning, as he was preparing for a seminar at Caltech, finally beginning the program he had deferred, he received a letter from a boy named Deshaun. It read, Dear Mr. Elijah. My teacher said I was dumb at math. I used to believe her. Then I saw your video and joined your class at the church. You taught me that numbers are a language. Now I want to be a math teacher too. Thank you for making me feel like I belong. P.S. I solved that problem from your chalkboard. I'm sending my answer. Love, Deshaun, age 12. Elijah read the letter 3 times. A lump rose in his throat. He pinned it above his desk. Because in the end, this was never just a story about calculus, or even about a genius. It was a story about humanity. About what happens when someone refuses to let the world's smallness define their greatness. About the quiet power of holding your head high when others expect you to shrink. And above all, it was a story of a boy from the back row, who changed the front row, the classroom, the institution, and then the world, not with vengeance, but with vision. And that story was just beginning.